Is Dandadan already the perfect anime? If you know nothing about Dandadan, you've probably at least seen panels like this one. Add in the weird aliens and scary looking monsters, and Dandadan is probably the most bizarre looking series besides maybe Chainsaw Man. But there is one concern I have. When the anime was announced, it was revealed that it would be animated by Science Saru, who you might know from the recent Scott Pilgrim anime. And while they're one of the most famous studios in the industry, there's something about their approach to animation that has me worried about this adaptation. So in this video, I'd like to discuss the unique art style of Dandadan, the history of Science Saru's projects, and some of the pros and cons that we can expect in this adaptation. Now, I've been reading Dandadan for about a year or so, probably more like 2 years. It's drawn by Yukinobu Tatsu. Having read Dandadan for about 2 years and seen his art in other places like Street Fighter, there's 3 things I would say he's really good at. First, he really likes to draw chibi faces and emote faces. I don't know why. I don't really think there's any special reason for this, other than he likes to tell silly stories and chibi faces are really funny. In general, he likes to draw characters in a fairly cartoonish way. In this regard, Science Saru is actually a perfect studio. Science Saru has been around for a decade now, and the one thing that stands out the most in all of their projects is their rough, loose approach to animation. One aspect of this is that their characters, while full of personality, generally tend to have simplistic designs. In other words, while their characters all look cool, they're usually not gonna have a ton of detail. You can see it in Devilman Crybaby, you can see it in Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken, and you can obviously see it in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Scott Pilgrim already had a cartoonish look to it in the comics, so staying faithful to the aesthetic wasn't that hard for Science Saru given that's kind of their thing. Transitioning into their next project, it is safe to say this will also be true for Dandadan. However, it is also worth noting that in the trailer, there's plenty of shots where the characters are fairly detailed as well. But I'll say more on that later in the video as I express some of my concerns for the anime. In any event, that's the first thing I would say stands out about Tatsu's style. He's got a lot of cartoony characters with a lot of goofy expressions. And as far as I can tell, we can expect all of those to be translated into the anime. Now, let's get into the next point. Actually, before I do that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, the second thing that stands out about Tatsu's art style is the motion. One thing that I'm starting to notice in manga is that it isn't necessarily how detailed you can make something. That definitely has its time and place. But especially in a lot of these battle series, what's probably more important than anything else is the artist's ability to express motion. So for example, this is something Akira Toriyama is really good at in Dragon Ball. The two series are fairly similar in that they both have a lot of simple character designs, but they're both full of action. And the action in both series is insanely intense thanks to the talent of their respective creators. It's funny because you usually see weird panels like with UFOs abducting cows or panels like this with crazy monsters. But there's a ton of panels where a character will do a kick or a punch or use some crazy ability, and it's not just how detailed the page is that makes it cool. What really makes panels like this so cool is how real they look. It's partly due to how Tatsu will emphasize something in the panel and lean into it like a foot or an arm. Combine that with a few other factors and you get these really intense looking panels. Thankfully, this is something Science Saru is famous for. Like I said, they have a rough, loose approach to animation. And part of that, like we discussed, means that they tend to use fairly simple character designs, but the other part of that is they focus heavily on motion. Science Saru's calling card is throwing in a scene where suddenly everything looks kinda trippy, or the characters will go completely unhinged and go all out in a fight. For example, in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, they did a really good job with this when they did that scene with Lucas Lee when he goes skateboarding. The shape of his character is all over the place, but it bends to the flow of his movement as he skates from one scene to another. And obviously you can see this in a lot of the fight scenes as well. I always like to point out the fight between Ramona versus Roxy, but there's a bunch of other examples. So in this respect, I don't think there could be a more perfect pick for Dandadan. Science Saru is kind of the studio to pick for this project. I'm sure every meathead and their brother wanted MAPPA to get this one, but I honestly don't think that would have been a great choice. MAPPA is great and all, but their anime kinda looks samey. Whereas Science Saru has its calling cards, but still manages to make each of its projects feel completely special. And the same will probably be true for Dandadan. But I do just have one concern, and this is where we get into that thing I mentioned earlier. Remember how I mentioned how the trailer looks pretty detailed? Well, I'm not sure that'll be true for most of the anime. And that's a problem. See, Tatsu is good at 3 things. We talked about the funny faces, we talked about the expression of motion, but the other thing he's really good at is detailed drawings. There's a myriad of panels I could pull up, but the thing is, it's basically like every chapter that we get at least one crazy looking double spread that's super detailed. Granted, he's on Jump Plus and not Weekly Shonen Jump, but the fact that Tatsu is able to put out chapters like this every week is godly. It's for this reason that when Dandadan ends, I think Tatsu should be considered among all of the other great mangaka. The level of detail he includes in these chapters really brings these characters to life, which is especially important for the aliens and monsters because it makes them feel that much more real and adds to the spooky tone of the series. This is also why this is a huge concern of mine going into the anime. Like I said before, the trailer we've seen so far is pretty detailed, so if we're just going by the trailer, then the assumption would be that the entire anime will look like this. But there's a couple of reasons why I'm not sure that's going to be the case. First of all, it's almost never the case when an anime is adapting a manga. Simply by the nature of animation, the animated adaptation is generally going to include less details than the source material in order to make the animation project feasible. Simply put, the more detail you want to put in each frame, the more time you have to spend animating those frames. So manga has the advantage in that you don't have to animate the whole chapter. You can tell the story in panels, whereas an anime doesn't have that luxury. Hence why you always see these bogus anime versus manga comparisons on Twitter. Another reason I don't think this will be the case is because of Science Saru. Like I said before, Science Saru focuses on expression of motion, and they do this at the deliberate expense of detail. So in other words, while everything is animated really well, they typically don't put a ton of effort into drawing as many details as they can because they want the focus to be on action and character expression. You can see it in Devilman Crybaby, and you can see it in Keep Your Hands Off Isaacan. So given all of this information, odds are we're going to lose this aspect of Tatsu's art style. Incidentally, some fans may watch the anime and try to claim that the anime is watered down, or that it makes Dandadan look ugly. Fortunately, I don't think this will ever turn into a serious problem. Like I just said, this always happens when an anime adapts a manga. You're never going to have that same level of detail. But even so, what we've seen in the trailer looks amazing. Plus, this is Science Saru we're talking about. They're one of the weirdest studios out there, and Dandadan is one of the weirdest manga out there. So the two are a perfect match. Sure, it's not going to look exactly like the manga, but think of all the stuff Science Saru will contribute. They will only make the characters funnier with their cartoonish art style, making them feel more real in turn. And with all of the insane fights in this series and Tatsu's emphasis on motion, Science Saru is the perfect studio to help bring this manga to life. So while it may not look exactly how you're expecting, I think the new Dandadan anime is going to be a pleasant surprise for everyone. It's for these reasons and more that I couldn't think of a better studio for this series than Science Saru. But now I'd like to hear what you think. What do you think of Tatsu's art style? What do you think of Science Saru? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my other video on Science Saru. In that discussion, I explain the evolution of Science Saru and everything they did to make Scott Pilgrim a success. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.